A 4-year-old in a typical American household can already learn to believe that the rules simply do not apply to him. Meanwhile, another child raised just a few streets away grows up with empathy, patience, and the ability to handle disappointment without falling apart. So what is actually happening in those early years that pushes one child toward entitlement and self-obsession while another grows into a grounded, caring adult? And why do so many therapists say they are seeing more narcissistic traits in young adults today than ever before? What parents do, often with the best intentions, quite literally shapes how a child's sense of self develops. Some of these patterns are so common that most parents do not even realize they are doing them. By the end of this video, you will understand the 6 parenting habits that researchers and clinicians most often link to narcissistic development in children, and why they are becoming more common across the United States. Psychologists who study narcissism have noticed a pattern. Children raised with these 6 specific habits are far more likely to develop an inflated sense of self, a fragile ego underneath it, and real difficulty handling criticism or failure later in life. What makes this pattern so easy to fall into is that none of these habits look harmful in the moment. They often look like love. Let us break down these 6 steps, starting with the one that plants the earliest seeds. Step 1. Praise everything, especially the child, not the effort. Parents raising a narcissist tend to praise the child constantly, but the praise is usually aimed at who the child is rather than what the child does. Phrases like, "You are so special," and "You are better than everyone else" get repeated far more often than "You worked really hard on that." This may sound harmless, even encouraging, but developmental psychologists note an important distinction. When praise is tied to identity, rather than effort, children begin to build their self-worth around being inherently superior, rather than around what they accomplish through effort. When that superiority is inevitably challenged later, by a teacher, a coach, or a friend, the child has no internal resilience to fall back on, because their entire sense of self was built on being told they were exceptional, rather than on learning that they could grow. Parents who want to avoid this pattern learn to praise the process instead of the person, noticing effort, persistence, and improvement rather than innate greatness. Step 2. Shield the child from every consequence. In many households, when a child makes a mistake, breaks a rule, or hurts someone's feelings, the parent immediately steps in to smooth things over. A teacher assigns a low grade, and the parent argues with the school. A child is unkind to a sibling, and the parent explains it away instead of addressing it. This constant shielding sends a clear message over time. It tells the child that consequences are for other people. Researchers who study child development have found that when children never experience the natural results of their own actions, they fail to develop accountability. Instead, they develop a deep expectation that the world will always bend around them. A child who is never allowed to feel the discomfort of a real consequence never learns how to sit with guilt, apologize sincerely, or adjust their behavior. That skill has to be built early, and it can only be built through actual experience, not through explanation after the fact. Step 3. Make the child the center of every conversation. In some households, family conversations, gatherings, and even simple daily interactions revolve almost entirely around one child. Their achievements, their opinions, and their preferences take priority over everyone else's. Siblings learn to go quiet. Other family members learn to accommodate. This constant centering teaches a child that their needs are automatically more important than the needs of the people around them. Family therapists frequently point out that children learn empathy the same way they learn language, through repeated exposure and practice. A child who is rarely asked about someone else's day, who is rarely required to listen rather than speak, does not get the practice needed to genuinely consider another person's perspective. Empathy is not something children either have or do not have from birth. It is a skill, and skills require repetition to develop. Step 4. Use conditional affection tied to performance. This one is subtle, and many parents do it without ever realizing it. Affection, warmth, and attention increase sharply when a child performs well. wins or achieves something impressive, and quietly decrease when the child struggles or fails. The child begins to associate love with performance rather than with simply being themselves. Clinical psychologists who work with narcissistic patients often trace this pattern back to childhood, describing a hidden fragility underneath the confident exterior. The child grows into an adult who appears supremely self-assured, but who is actually terrified of failure, because failure was never safe in the first place. It threatened the very thing they needed most, their parents' warmth. Children need to know that they are loved during their worst moments just as much as during their best ones. That security is what actually builds a stable sense of self, rather than the appearance of one. Step 5. Model self-centered behavior at home. Children absorb far more from what they observe than from what they are told. A household where one or both parents frequently dismiss other people's feelings, take credit for shared efforts, or react to criticism with anger rather than reflection, is teaching a child how to move through the world long before any lesson is spoken aloud. Children are constant observers, and they tend to model the emotional patterns they grow up around, even when those patterns are never explicitly taught. If a child regularly sees a parent belittle a partner, dismiss a friend's feelings, or refuse to ever admit fault, the child learns that this is simply how confident, successful people behave. Parents who want to avoid raising a narcissist have to look honestly at their own patterns first, because children rarely do what we say and consistently do what we show them. Step 6. Protect the child's ego instead of building their character. Perhaps the most common step of all is the instinct to protect a child's feelings above almost everything else. Losing a game gets reframed so no one really lost. A poor performance gets softened with excessive reassurance rather than honest feedback. The intention is kindness, but the result is a child who never learns to tolerate the ordinary discomfort of not being the best at everything. Psychologists who work with young adults describe a generation increasingly unable to handle basic criticism, not because they are inherently fragile, but because they were rarely given the chance to practice resilience in smaller, safer moments during childhood. A child who is allowed to lose sometimes, to hear honest feedback delivered with care, and to sit with disappointment without a parent immediately rescuing them from it, develops something far more valuable than constant validation. They develop genuine confidence, the kind that can withstand an imperfect world. Raising a narcissist rarely comes from a lack of love. It comes from too much protection, shielding a child from struggle, and honest feedback in the name of confidence. Real confidence comes from knowing you can be imperfect and still be okay. Praise effort, not identity. Let small consequences happen. Ask about other people's feelings. Keep your affections steady. Model humility, and let your child feel safe disappointment sometimes. Which of these 6 patterns do you recognize in your household? Share the number below. In the next video, we look at the early warning signs of entitlement. Subscribe so you do not miss it.